So when we talk about the absolute basics of Photoshop, I know this is going to sound very rudimentary, but the very first thing we need to talk about is the Creative Cloud app, or it's like the brain that basically runs your entire Photoshop subscription that you have under the Creative Cloud grouping of applications. So when you open up that Creative Cloud app, whether you're on a Mac or a PC, this is going to be where you're going to go. If you go into apps, this is going to be where you have all of your Adobe applications installed from. So you can see that I have Photoshop CC installed, I've got Bridge installed, and I've got Adobe Camera Raw installed. If any of these needed to be updated, this button would say Update Now or something along those lines. If I needed to go back to another version, I have the option to go back to another version. At this point, if I say Other Versions, I can install a different version of Photoshop CC that I have owned within my plan with Photoshop. You see that I have Photoshop CS6, so CS6 is there. If we go down here, we have something like Bridge. If we were to click on this, again, there's other versions of Bridge, or we could uninstall Bridge, or we can launch our program right from here. I like to have my Photoshop down here in my toolbar. It's always there. So once I open it, I right-clicked it on a PC and said pin to my taskbar so that it's always there. Even if it's not open, it's a quick access for me to open it. So once I open Photoshop, especially if I'm opening Photoshop for the first time, it's going to look a little different if you're one of the users like I am, who's been with Photoshop for 20 years. This intro kind of working document thing that they open up with is a little weird, and I don't really care for it too much. So I'm going to show you how to fix that in this lesson. But this is where you can see any recent files that you've worked on. This is where you can find any of the files that you might have in the Adobe Creative Cloud in your cloud-based file storage, which you can see I have some of my favorite images in the cloud-based storage. And if you had any Lightroom photos, you can click Lightroom photos, but I don't necessarily have any, so that won't really help me at all because I don't have it installed. We could say Create New or Open. If we open, we're going to navigate to an image to open. If we say Create New, we're going to create a new document to work from. So when I press Create New, it pops open with a dialog for me to create a new canvas, so to speak. And we'll talk about image size and canvas in another lesson. I'm just going to go with the default that it has here and say Create. So this would be my workspace if I was just opening Photoshop for the very first time. It would look like this. It has basically what they call the Photoshop Essentials, and the way it's set up. The way it's set up, to me, is not necessarily conducive to a working environment or an environment that's going to help me with my photo post-processing. So what I've done is I've created my own workspaces that really help me out, and that's what we're going to get to. We're going to get to the point of creating our own workspace, but in order to do that, we have to first discuss things like the menus, the toolbars, and your preferences. Because the menus and the preferences, essentially, those two things are what get wrapped up into what is your workspace. And I'll talk about workspaces in the next lesson. For now, let's just talk about the difference between a menu and a toolbar and where the preferences are and what you can change in Photoshop. So a menu is anything that's up here. These are your menus. These are Adobe Basic standard menus. You can't change what's happening in this menu up here, okay? So this menu up here has things in it that have different adjustments in it, from things like brightness to levels to curves, to duplicate and apply image. Many of the things that we do with hotkeys, like when I tell you to press Command or Control J to duplicate a background layer, that's essentially doing the same thing as going up to image and saying duplicate, okay? So some of the things that we do for hotkeys are essentially accessing menu items. So as I talk about things in Photoshop and as I educate about things in Photoshop, a lot of times I'm doing hotkey related items that are pointing to a menu. And the menus, they don't change, they don't move, you can't really control them. They are what they are, and they're there. The difference between a menu and a toolbar is that you can change the way a toolbar works. This menu that's happening below here is a menu that's specific to a tool that you're using. So the top bar is a menu, this top bar is kind of like a toolbar menu, and then we have our toolbar on the left side and our toolbar on the right side. And these are where you can put stuff that you want to be able to see in your images or where you can modify your tools. So you can't modify these menus up here, and you can't modify this secondary menu here that's applying itself to a toolbar, to a tool, but you can modify toolbars. And toolbars are really good to be able to modify. So if I go up to Window, window right here, you see all these little check boxes right here? Any checkbox that you see in this window is relating to something in your workspace that you're doing. So right now, if we look at this workspace and you see color right here, that's got a checkbox next to it. That means I'm seeing color right here. If I look at this one where it says layers, I'm seeing my layers palette down here. If I were to click on something like actions, it's going to open up, but see how it opens up? It opens up in a secondary toolbar. I can move things around within this secondary toolbar. So when I'm in this toolbar, if I move this out, that's now basically making almost a third toolbar, essentially. You see how when I move this out from this toolbar, as I move it out, it can float around and be free floating. I don't suggest you have any of these things be free floating. I suggest you have them docked. So in order to dock them, you would just click and drag it and bring it over until you see a blue line. That blue line means that it's going to make its own toolbar, essentially. Or you can click this and drag this into any other existing toolbar. If you see that blue line, that means that it's going to put this actions underneath this right here, which is going to be our history palette. It's going to put the actions underneath the history palette. If I click on actions, notice how it just says actions right here. If I click this and drag this and bring it up and put it right on top of that history, now they're in the same group. Well, what's the difference between them being in the same group and being underneath each other? Well, now when I click on actions, look, I can navigate back and forth between history and actions within this toolbar. So you're basically making your own custom toolbar that would be for window flyouts. That's why I have this set up as a secondary toolbar over here. Over here on the left-hand side, we have another set of tools in a toolbar. These are all of the tools that you're going to use while you edit your image. And you can put this toolbar wherever you want. I've seen people take this toolbar and bring this toolbar over here and put it next to their secondary toolbar. So they have their flyout menus here, and then they have their tools here, and then all of their working space for their images right here. That is totally and completely up to you. What I like to do is I like to separate these tools from this toolbar. So I like to have my working tools that I use to edit my image over on the left-hand side, and I like to have my secondary window, my secondary toolbar set for windows like actions. So we can edit this toolbar that we see over here on the left-hand side. Notice anytime you look on a tool, you're not just stuck with just the tool that is present. If you click and hold on that tool, you'll see that there's a polygonal lasso tool in there, there's a magnetic lasso tool, and then there's the regular lasso tool. If we click and hold on the crop, there's the crop, the perspective crop, the slice tool, and the slice selected tool. Now, there are many tools that I just don't use in Photoshop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to Edit, and I'm going to go to Toolbar. And what that's going to do is it's going to pop open this toolbar in a visual platform. So when I look at this toolbar over here on the left-hand side, that is essentially all the things that are contained within. So if I were to click and hold on this Move tool up here, when it opens up, you would see that it says Move tool and Artboard tool. If I clicked and hold on this marquee, you'll see that there's all the different types of marquees. I already showed you what happened when I clicked and held on the lasso tool and what happened. The lasso tool was there, the polygonal lasso tool was there, and the magnetic lasso tool was there. So what we can do is if there's a tool in here that we don't necessarily want, I'm going to scroll down to something like the slice tool. I don't use the slice tool. I've actually never taught the slice tool. So I'm going to click it and drag it and move it over to extra tools. And that takes it out of there. I no longer have to see that tool because I don't use it anyway. If I scroll down a little bit more, I've got 3D material eyedropper tool. Well, I don't use 3D materials, so I'll click and hold that and bring that over. There are times when I use the eyedropper tool and the color sampler tool, and definitely the ruler tool, but the count tool, I don't use it. So I'll click it and drag it over and get it out of there. Coming over here, we have the red eye tool. I typically don't use that. I can fix red eye in many other ways, so I'll take that out of there. I do use all these other tools. So if I go to my brushes, I don't necessarily use the pencil tool too much, so I'll click and hold it and bring it out. I use the brush a lot. The color replacement tool is nice for very specific things. Looking right here, the pattern stamp tool, I typically don't use it, so I'm going to click and hold and drag that out of the clone stamp tool. The history brush tool, again, I don't use it too much. Art history brush tool, don't use it too much. Notice how my toolbar over here is getting slimmed down now. The eraser tool, I don't use any of these tools. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click right here and just drag the whole box over here and get rid of all those tools. I do use the gradient tool. I don't necessarily use the paint bucket tool. I will typically use something like a fill for that. So I can click and drag these out of here and get these tools out of here. Do you need all these tools over here? If you want all those tools over there, sure, you can put all the tools over there that you want, okay? But I'm only taking the tools that I use in my workflow and bringing them over there to the left-hand side. It thins things down. We're doing this to build efficiency and not leave extra things laying around. This would be like, imagine your garage workbench and you've got all your tools laid out. If you need to find a hammer and you've got 15 different hammers there, it might be kind of difficult to get the hammer that you actually need or the screwdriver that you actually need. That's why we categorize our tools on our workbench in our garage, hopefully. And that's why we do the same thing here in Photoshop. So that's how you would modify your toolbar. I'm not going to go too much further into this. I'm just going to press done. Up here where you see edit and preferences, this is where you can control everything that happens inside of Photoshop in the background. So if I click on general, just start with the general, this is going to give me all the things that I can change in Photoshop to look a little bit different or to act a little bit differently for me and for what's effective for me. So I told you at the beginning, I don't really like the way Photoshop starts up asking me what I want to open and what I want to do. Typically when I want to edit something in Photoshop, I double click on it somewhere else and I bring it open into Photoshop. So right here where it says show start workspace when no documents are open, I can uncheck that because I don't want that. And then use legacy new document interface. I don't really care for the new Photoshop CC new document interface, so I'll check that box. I'm getting it back to the basics of what Photoshop was when I first started, essentially by doing that with the new document interface. By all means, if you like that start workspace and you like the new document interface, keep those checked and unchecked respectively, okay? The next thing is the interface. How do I want Photoshop to interact? How do I want my UI to look? Do I want the UI to be large, medium, or small? Do I want the things to be really big, or do I want them to be really small? I tend to keep them basically on the small side and not necessarily on the large side, so I'll keep them small. The UI scaling, this is if you needed to see things a little bit larger because they're too small. You could change that from 100% to 200%. I'll keep it at 100%. And let's not forget here we actually have our color theme. So we can make Photoshop dark or we can make it really bright. This is what Photoshop used to look like way back in the day. Or we can make it this kind of neutral gray. I like the darker gray. So I've done a whole lot of discussion on color theory in the past. And you'd be shocked that even these four colors here will alter the way that you edit your images based on how colors will interact with your workspace. And I'll show that here in the next video so you can see what I'm talking about. But then we'll go down to workspace. Right here where it says open documents as tabs. What that means is that this document is opened up as a tab. Anything that I open up will open up as tabs along the top of Photoshop. That's great if you're working on 1 or 2 images at a time, but if you're trying to composite images and lay them on top of each other, it's not conducive to that workflow. So I'm going to go ahead and uncheck that so that my documents don't open as tabs. But if I want them to be tabs, I can enable the floating window docking so that I can click and drag that layer up and it will attach itself to the top. We have large tabs and small tabs. Look at the tabs here along the top. You see that says layers and channels and paths. Watch when I press uncheck large tabs. We get these smaller tabs. I like the smaller tabs because it makes my workspace a little bit, opens it up a little bit more and doesn't have any excess space added to anything else, okay? You can play with the enable narrow options. Note that right here it says changes will take effect next time you start Photoshop. So a lot of these effects won't take place right away. You're going to have to restart Photoshop in order for those to happen. If we go to tools, this is going to show you all different ways that you can make your tools change. I don't do much with that. History log, I don't do a whole lot with that either. File handling, I don't do a whole lot with the file handling either. If we go to export, I don't do a whole lot with export either. Under performance, this is where I do a little bit, right? I think by default, Photoshop is set to take 75% of your system resources. I like to have mine set at 80%. And notice I also change my history states to 99. And I also like to use my graphics processor to handle any highly intensive graphics processes. If by chance you don't have a very good graphics processor, you can uncheck that and it will not use that graphics processor. I have a 6 GB video card. I have a 6 gig video card for a reason. You see it's a GeForce GTX 1060. The reason why is because I do a lot of video editing with the business that I do. What would I say you actually need for Photoshop? I'd say a good 1 to 2 GB video card, not onboard graphics, but an actual video card would be ideal for a lot of the processes that you're going to do in Photoshop. Scratch disks. I like to set up a scratch disk somewhere else on my computer, and that's basically a temporary place that Photoshop is going to store things while you're working on your images. I don't like to do that on my C drive unless all I have is my C drive. So for instance, on one of my older laptops, all I have is a C drive. So my scratch disks will take place on my C drive along with all the other things that are happening there. If you have multiple drives, maybe a storage drive somewhere, these scratch disks typically don't take up a whole lot of space, but you can put your scratch disk on something else. Notice how I don't have my C drive as my scratch disk. I have my F drive as my scratch disk. You can even get really technical with this and change the cursors on things. I like to keep most of the things within Photoshop standard to Photoshop. There's 2 reasons why. Number 1, when I'm educating you, if I change things to look different here, the first thing you're gonna say is, well, why doesn't my cursor look like that? So that's why I typically keep mine to a normal brush tip. The second reason why I don't do a whole lot of changing with Photoshop here is because every time I update Photoshop or I have to uninstall and reinstall Photoshop, I lose these preferences. So I like to keep it pretty simple. So when I look at something like this general tab, that's changing the start workspace and the legacy. When I go to interface, that's making my tabs smaller. When I go to my workspace, again, making my tabs smaller, enable floating window documents, no open documents as tabs. And then going into something like performance, I change that to about 80% of my system resources. Notice I'm using 64 gigs of RAM to run my machine. That's quite a bit of RAM, but that's enough RAM for me to allocate a lot of system resources to Photoshop when Photoshop runs. So I still have 20 gigabytes of RAM that is available to other applications on my computer. So I know I spit out things like 64 gigs of RAM and 6 GB video card, but these are some of the things that really help Photoshop fly for me and work really fast. So we'll go ahead and press OK. The only thing I really need to show you now is that as you pull a tool, any of these tools over here, notice how this menu changes. This is a tool menu. This is your primary menu for Photoshop. This is your tool menu that controls different tools. And as I educate things throughout F64 Elite and all these other courses that I do, I will talk about how these things will change your brushes and stuff. Really just want to introduce you to the different concepts. That menus are at the top. You get to set up your toolbars any way you want and put them wherever you want in your workspace. And you can change your preferences at any time within Photoshop so that you can set up Photoshop very specifically for your workflow efficiency. So what I'm going to do before we go to the next lesson is I've made some changes to Photoshop. So I'm going to close Photoshop and then we're going to hop in and I'm going to talk about workspaces.